recognizing the House Leader of the third party.
Mr. Speaker, for the record, I'll be the designated speaker for the Green Caucus. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the motion put forward by the member for North Coast Haida Gwaii, the Minister of Environment and Parks. Mr. Speaker, I'm very disturbed by the comments by the MLA for Columbia River Revelstoke, and I will take the time I have to speak in support of this motion, and I trust the MLA for Columbia River Revelstoke will take the time to listen to what I have to say with an open mind. I thank the Minister for stepping forward in this manner, for calling us together in support of fundamental truths. I acknowledge that in doing so, she puts herself in a position to be targeted by those who spread hate and disinformation and call into question her motivation and integrity. And I thank her for her courage in refusing to be silenced. I raise my hands to the Minister, to the Indigenous members of her caucus and across this House who will step forward in support of this motion, and to the truth tellers and knowledge holders across this province and across the country who speak bravely and fiercely to bring truths to light, to remind us of those truths. We must always be reminded. I acknowledge that in too many cases, they speak on behalf of people who didn't make it, and I'm sorry for the burden that they carry. The truth has been hard fought in this country. One of the tools of genocide, of colonization, is limiting access to information. Early settlers were upfront about their desire to ensure Indigenous communities weren't easily able to share their history and their truths. There was an extensive set of measures put in place, including residential schools, forcible relocation to reservations, outlawing of ceremonies such as the potlatch, designed to ensure that history and culture could not be passed on. And that is why we must take such great care with the truth, why we have such a responsibility to seek it out, to share it, and to defend it. One of the reports that the Minister referenced, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, spent 6 years traveling to all parts of Canada and heard from over 6,000 witnesses. That is over 6,000 people who spoke about their history, their family's history, their experience of genocide perpetrated by this country. The mandate of the Commission was to reveal to Canadians the complex truth about the history and the ongoing legacy of the church-run residential schools in a manner that fully documents the individual and collective harms perpetrated against Indigenous peoples and honors the resilience and courage of former students, their families and communities, and to guide and inspire a process of truth and healing, leading towards reconciliation within Indigenous families and between Aboriginal peoples and non-Aboriginal communities, churches, governments, and Canadians generally. The process was to work to renew relationships on a basis of inclusion, mutual understanding, and respect, Mr. Speaker. This mandate sets out an expectation for all of us as individuals and as representatives to learn the history of the lands on which we stand. For those of us, such as myself, who aren't Indigenous, it sets out an expectation and puts a responsibility upon me to understand the experiences of the people upon whose lands I work, live, and play, and to commit myself to doing better than my ancestors did. There is never a time when we shouldn't reflect on the importance of this. As elected representatives, there is a clear expectation upon all of us to remember the actions of our predecessors who stood in this very building and who made decisions whose actions live on. We must face that responsibility squarely. We cannot attempt to ignore it or pretend it did not happen. For too long, the policy of this House was outright denial of the Indigenous rights and titles, or even attempts to eliminate peoples altogether. The history of these lands and this place is a burden that we must all shoulder in order to walk forward together. The stories in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's reports reveal the depths that the government went to try and eliminate the peoples of this land, and their stories are evidence of the failure to do so. This report is one of the greatest gifts that we could ever receive. It is a beacon for the future, and we must respect it as such. We owe it to the people who told their stories, who spoke on behalf of themselves, and those who didn't survive, to treat this history with deep respect and with a deep and true desire to do all that we can to ensure that this never happens again. The authors of the report, Justice Murray Sinclair, Chief Wilton Littlechild, and Dr. Marie Wilson, said it so well in their introduction to the Survivors Speak section of the report. A survivor is not just someone who made it through the schools or got by or was making do. A survivor is a person who persevered against and overcame adversity. The word came to mean someone who emerged victorious, though not unscathed, whose head was bloody but unbowed. It referred to someone who had taken all that could be thrown at them and remained standing at the end. It came to mean someone who could legitimately say, "I am still here." For that achievement, survivors deserve our highest respect. But for that achievement, we also owe them the debt of doing the right thing, coming out of this history. That introduction is a call to action for all members of this House. More than almost any other people, we have an ability to set the direction for the next 100 years of interaction between our government, First Nations, and Indigenous peoples across this province. Each year, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission provides an annual report outlining the work that has been done to uphold and progress the Commission's work. Executive Director of the National Commission for Truth and Reconciliation, Stephanie Smith, comments, "There are hard truths about our country's colonial history that some people are still not prepared to hear and do not want to be told, but we all must lean the true history of residential schools, listen to survivors, and take a stand against deniers. Sadly, we see increased ugliness from those who deny our truths, experience, and oral histories as reality, and that is something that we must address. It is disheartening, to say the least, to read hateful comments challenging the documented experiences of Indigenous people, particularly survivors, people perpetuating myths like it didn't happen, or some good came out of the schools is bad enough, but reading statements like children never died in those institutions is truly repugnant. At the NCTR, we see these baseless claims and attempts to erase history firsthand, and they must be countered with education and truth. But the responsibility of truth-telling should not be placed solely on survivors' shoulders. Each and every Canadian must reflect on the role they can play in reconciliation. It requires institutions, governments, and individuals to live up to their responsibilities and complete and fulfill the TRC's 94 calls to action. While the Commission has made significant progress, there remains a great deal of work ahead to address the ongoing denialism and injustices that persist. True progress requires action and reparations, and we must never forget that each and every one of us has a role to play in truth and reconciliation. We have work to do, but we must always take the time to remind ourselves of the history that has led to this point where we are taking the steps. As Stephanie Scott points out, those who deny the claims of realities of residential school do harm to survivors and do harm to all Canadians as we walk the path of reconciliation. And those who deny the claims of residential schools and the harm of colonization clearly also ignore the reality that we see every day. The harms of colonization are not something that is in the past, but something that we continue to live with. It persists in the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in our justice system, in the overrepresentation of Indigenous people and people experiencing homelessness, and the challenges that still exist between Indigenous peoples and police forces. I was glad that the minister referenced the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. One of the truly heartbreaking damages that our colonial system continues to exert is in the numbers of Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people who are missing or who are murdered. We know the names of some of these women, names like Carson Mackenzie Seaweed and Chelsea Poorman, but there are so many more that we do not. Women and girls who deserve to live, to be with their families and their friends, who deserve a government that prioritizes their safety. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Women and Girls presented their final report in 2019. The final report reveals that persistent and deliberate human Indigenous rights violations and abuses are the root cause behind Canada's staggering rates of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI+ people. The two-volume report calls for transformative legal and social change to resolve the crisis that has devastated Indigenous communities across the country. The final report is comprised of the truths of more than 2,380 family members, survivors of violence, experts, and knowledge keepers, shared over 2 years of cross-country public hearings and evidence gathering. It delivers 231 individual calls for justice directed at governments, institutions, social service providers, industries, and all Canadians. 6 years on from the delivery of this final report, Indigenous women are 4 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to be victims of violence. Indigenous women make up 16% of all female homicide victims, 11% of missing women, yet Indigenous people make up only 4.3% of the population of Canada. 56% of Indigenous women have suffered physical assault, and 46 have experienced sexual assault. By comparison, about 1/3 of non-Indigenous women have suffered these assaults in their lifetimes. The Assembly of First Nations has repeatedly called out the lack of progress in implementing the findings of the inquiry, and in the 2024 progress report were clear on their expectations for all levels of government to do better in this work. They noted it is not enough for institutions like governments, police forces, hospitals, courts, and the criminal justice system to use cultural awareness training as a cure-all for systemic institutional racism. These institutions must undertake an honest review of their laws, regulations, policies, and practices to uncover the built-in systemic biases against First Nations people and commit to making real substantive changes. This is the work that this House needs to do as well, to go beyond awareness and to undertake a clear-eyed review of how our processes, our biases, and our adherence to historic norms entrench systemic racism that makes life more difficult for Indigenous members, Indigenous staff, and all British Columbians who look to this House. I want to acknowledge the work that our Speaker is leading in this area, and I urge all members to support him, to continue to support him, and to ensure this work is a high priority. However, of the 231 calls for justice in the final report, only 2 have been completed. This is unacceptable. We must do better. We owe it to the Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people in our lives to make clear that we value them, we love them, and we will do all that we can to protect and uplift them. This is why our caucus has pushed so hard for public safety and police reform, why we continue to urge the government to spend more protecting Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited people as they do protecting industry, and why we continue to raise concerns about systemic racism within the Ministry of Children and Family Development. These are systemic issues. They need a systemic response. But unlike my colleague earlier on this side of the House, we will work with the government, and we are not pointing fingers. We see a path forward. There's a lot of work to do, and we want to work together, not in with the tone and approach that we heard earlier. I raised my hands to my predecessor as MLA for Saanich North and the Islands, Adam Olsen, who rightly took issue with the government investing more in policing opposition to resource development than it does on protecting First Nations. Opposition that is frequently Indigenous-led and generally occurs in remote areas, such as the Wet'suwet'en opposition to the Coastal GasLink pipeline throughout northern BC. In this section of the House, we are committed to working through these issues in the priority they deserve. The offer remains open to all members of the House, particularly those members with responsibility in these areas, to bring life to these recommendations. The reports on systemic challenges that First Nations and Indigenous people face do not end with these two reports. I'd like to also speak to the In Plain Sight report, which looks into Indigenous-specific racism within the British Columbian healthcare system. The report was finalized in 2020 and found a BC healthcare system with widespread systemic racism against Indigenous peoples. This racism results in a range of negative impacts, harm, and even death. The review also found that this widespread racism has long been known by many within the healthcare system, including those in positions of authority, and is widely acknowledged by many who work in the system. The report contains the following contextual statement, which is true of the healthcare system and of so many systems which we oversee as a legislative assembly. I quote, "This review has been conducted in a moment of increasing understanding about the colonial history of Canada and its enduring legacy and the moment of transition we are in. Prejudice and racism against Indigenous peoples have roots in colonial beliefs that Indigenous peoples were weak, less worthy of care, dying off, incapable, savage, and primitive. These beliefs, embedded in laws and policies for more than a century, have shaped and continue to permeate public services such as health, education, justice, and child welfare. A lack of readily available factual information, knowledge, and understanding about this history contributes to ongoing negative attitudes and social inequities." The report found that widespread Indigenous-specific stereotyping, racism, and discrimination exist in the British Columbian healthcare system, that racism limits access to medical treatment and negatively affects the health and wellness of Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, that Indigenous women and girls are disproportionately impacted by Indigenous-specific racism in the healthcare system, that Indigenous healthcare workers face racism and discrimination in their work environments. We are seeing the outcomes of this disparity every day in our communities, in our families, across the entire province. And we can see firsthand the impact that it is having on life expectancy among First Nations people in British Columbia, which has dropped by more than 6 years between 2017 and 2021, a loss of 6 years, from 73.3 years to 67.2 years. And yet people have the audacity to stand up and suggest that racism doesn't exist, that discrimination doesn't exist. This statistic hits particularly hard for me today as I mark my 69th birthday, a milestone that now, on average, more than half of Indigenous peoples in this province will not reach. I think of the years that I have ahead of me, contributing as a member of this House, as a member of a community, a family, as a husband and a father, and I think of the loss to communities who are losing their elders before they are old. Systemic racism has torn communities apart. It has deprived people of their family members before their time. It has stopped the passing down of lessons, of language, of learnings, of time, and it is the fault of the institutions such as this House and of the system that we oversee, and we must work together to answer all of this. Today is a milestone in so many ways. It is the 9th anniversary of the declaration of the toxic drug crisis as a public health emergency in British Columbia, and it feels apt that we're having this discussion on this day, and with that at the forefront of our minds. One of the other findings of the In Plain Sight report was that current public health emergencies magnify racism and vulnerabilities and disproportionately impact Indigenous peoples. The First Nations Health Authority reports monthly on the impact of the toxic drug crisis in British Columbia, and I thank them for their data. In December 2024, the last month for which data is publicly available, they found there were a total of 219 paramedic-attended drug poisoning events reported amongst First Nations people. This represents an 11.2% increase from the previous month and a almost 16% decrease from December 23. But First Nations people represented 20.6% of all toxic drug poisoning events this month. In 2024, women represented 38.3% of all First Nations toxic drug poisoning events. Among other residents, 25.6% of all drug poisoning events involved women. In December 2024, we lost an additional 24 First Nations people due to toxic drug poisoning. First Nations people represent 16.3% of all deaths this month. Since 2016, the year in which a public health emergency was declared, we have lost 2,536 First Nations people to toxic drug poisoning. I could go on. It remains shocking to me that in the year 2025, we need to continue to have these conversations. There are people within this province that would disagree with the statements made by the government's Indigenous caucus this afternoon. It remains shocking to me that such blatant discrimination and racism has been normalized and accepted in this incredible place that we are allowed to call home. And so I would like to end today with some fundamental truth that speak to the heart on behalf of the Green Caucus. The rights of Indigenous peoples are inherent, existing, and cannot be infringed upon. First Nations hold rights and title to the land because it was never legally surrendered or ceded, and with very few exceptions, and historic treaties have not been honored. Ignoring this reality is not only unjust, but also creates uncertainty and leads to costly, protracted litigation for the province. While economic reconciliation is essential, it is not enough. We must strive for full reconciliation, supporting Indigenous peoples as they heal from the damaging legacies of colonization. Reconciliation should inspire Indigenous and non-Indigenous individuals to transform Canadian society, ensuring that future generations can live together in dignity, peace, and prosperity on these shared lands. I've been honored to get to know and work with so many nations over the course of my career, among them Hwayet First Nations, Cowichan Tribes, Tsawwassen First Nation. The Hwayet honored me with the traditional name Notsoshluk, which means always watching in Nuu-chah-nulth. It is a name I carry with pride and deep respect for the responsibility it carries. It is in the spirit of that name that I rise today to honor the comments put forward by the Minister of Environment and Parks. It is in that spirit that I congratulate the government for the work they have done on upholding Indigenous rights and title and incorporating the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in British Columbia. That is very important work, and we should all be congratulating the government for that work. And it is also in that spirit that I will call attention respectfully to the work that is yet to be done, to the many ways in which this House, this institution, and the system that it upholds continues to fail Indigenous people across this province. Mr. Speaker, I've spoken at length today about the impact that colonization, the history of residential schools, and genocide have had on Indigenous communities within British Columbia. This has been a tough speech to make, and I'm sure a tough speech to hear for those members here today. But I appreciate and thank you for hearing these words. I do want to speak briefly to the settlers and their descendants, those of us who are feeling awkward as we sit in this room and hear of the actions of our ancestors and their compatriots. I want to acknowledge that it can be really challenging to hear about the harms perpetrated by those who came before, the people whose actions allowed you to be here today. We all want to reflect positively on our families, to think back fondly on our grandparents and great-grandparents, and the idea that our families did harm, that they displaced people, that they committed genocide is challenging. But I urge you to sit with that feeling, to think not about the people who have committed harms, but to think instead about those who were certainly the victims of it. This is not the time for white fragility. This is the time to acknowledge the harms of the past in order that we may learn from them and ensure that they do not happen again. We who sit in this House give many gifts to our descendants, one that not all of our ancestors have given to us. Our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren will never have to wonder where we stood on an issue. Thanks to the wonderful team at Hansard, our words and actions will be readily available for them to see. And so I urge everyone who is feeling uncomfortable today to be the ancestor that they wish they had, to speak up, to speak out, to acknowledge that we built our country on stolen lands, that genocide was committed in our name, and then to move forward with that knowledge, to be better and to do better, and to remember that we are not the victims, but we can contribute to a better future. I want to speak, though, to the strengths of our Indigenous peoples across this province. I do not want to leave this speech in a strengths-based manner, because that is what our First Nations peoples deserve, what they continue to demonstrate day after day, month after month. These people are survivors. They have faced racism and discrimination, but they're so much more than that. Indigenous peoples have lived on and stewarded these lands since time immemorial. All of the Indigenous people I know are strong, smart, thoughtful people. They're funny. They're interesting. They have so much more than the wrongs that their people have faced. The Indigenous people that I know are great parents, strong community members. They're athletes, performers, professionals, business people. And in the shocking statistics that we're speaking of today, I don't want us to lose sight of that. Every community is more than the worst things that have happened to them. And this is so true for Indigenous communities in British Columbia. I want to once again acknowledge the Minister of Environment and Parks for her role in pulling today together and for sharing her experiences so fully and allowing us an opportunity to reflect on and support the motion in front of us. As Antonio Lemaire, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, said, "We are all here to stay." And it is with that in mind that each of us must work together every day to complete the hard work of putting this genocidal chapter of our history as British Columbians and Canadians behind us and building a bright future for Indigenous people across this province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.